Something ended in the 1970s. Not all at once, and not everywhere at the same moment, but across a decade that began in one America and ended in a recognizably different one. Something that had been the center of daily life for millions of families quietly came apart. It was not a disaster. Nobody declared it over. There was no single morning when the American housewife ceased to exist and something else took her place. It happened the way most large things happen, gradually, and then suddenly, through 100 small changes that each seemed reasonable on their own, and that together produced a transformation so complete that the generation that lived through it could not quite say when exactly it had occurred. The woman who had organized American household life since the post-war years, who had kept the kitchen running and the laundry moving, and the meals planned, and the children fed, and the home in the particular order that those homes were kept in, did not disappear. But her role changed so fundamentally in the 1970s that by the end of the decade, the household she returned to every evening looked almost nothing like the one her mother had managed, and the life she was living bore almost no resemblance to the life that the magazines of the 1950s had described as the natural and fulfilling destiny of an American woman. This video is about what changed, not as a political argument for or against the changes, not as a celebration or a lament, as an honest account of what the American household lost and what it gained, what the 1970s dismantled that the 1950s had built, and what the consequences of those changes look like today from a distance long enough to see them clearly. If you have ever wondered why American family life feels so different from what your parents or grandparents describe, and why so many of the habits and rhythms that made those homes feel the way they did have simply vanished, what happened in the 1970s is most of the answer. Stay with us. Consider subscribing before we begin. We find these turning points in American daily life one at a time, and there are many more still worth understanding. One honest word before we start. The changes of the 1970s were not simply a loss. Many of them were necessary corrections to arrangements that were genuinely unfair to women, that limited their economic options, that confined their intellectual and professional lives to spaces far smaller than their abilities warranted. We are not going to pretend otherwise. What we are going to do is account honestly for everything that changed, the gains alongside the losses, because the full picture is more complicated and more interesting than either nostalgia or progress narrative alone can contain. What the American housewife was. To understand what ended, you need to understand what existed. The American housewife of the 1950s and early 1960s was not a figure from a television commercial, though television commercials were among the forces that shaped how she understood herself and how the culture understood her. She was a manager. The household she ran was a genuine enterprise with real logistics, real economics, real skill requirements, and real consequences when it was mismanaged. She managed a food budget that typically represented between 20 and 25% of household income, according to Department of Agriculture statistics from the period. She planned weekly menus made organized shopping lists, purchased food from multiple specialized vendors, stored it properly, cooked it from scratch 3 times a day, and maintained the kind of waste rate that the modern household has not approached since. Because every dollar spent on food was a dollar that mattered. She managed the physical maintenance of the home, not by hiring cleaners or scheduling cleaning services, but by doing the work herself, according to a daily, weekly, and seasonal schedule that kept the home in the state of order that her generation considered the baseline standard. The Monday wash, the Tuesday ironing, the Wednesday cleaning, the Thursday shopping, the Friday baking that many households maintained was not arbitrary habit. It was a system refined across generations to match the realistic capacity of one person to maintain a home of a specific size to a specific standard. She managed the family's social relationships. Correspondence was answered. Neighbors were visited. Church and community obligations were met. The family's connections to its extended network were maintained by a person who had the time during the week to tend to them, which is why those connections were so much stronger in that era than in the era that replaced it, when both adults in a household are employed full-time, and the social maintenance that takes daytime hours cannot happen because daytime hours are no longer available for it. She managed the children, not merely in the sense of physical care, though physical care was substantial and real. She was present. At home when children came home from school, available in the afternoon for the conversation that children will not initiate if the parent is not there to receive it. Present for the slow, undramatic hours of childhood that produce, across years of accumulation, the attachment and security that developmental psychology consistently identifies as the foundation of adult mental health. This is what existed. Not perfection, not universal happiness, not freedom from the real constraints that the role imposed on real women with real aspirations that extended beyond the household, but a genuine, skilled, economically significant contribution to family life that the culture of the 1950s undervalued in ways that would eventually produce the corrections of the following decade. The forces that were building. The changes of the 1970s did not originate in the 1970s. They had been building for decades, and understanding them requires going back to the forces that were already reshaping American women's relationship with work and the home before the decade that finalized the transformation. The Second World War had introduced millions of American women to paid employment outside the home, not as a radical choice, but as a patriotic obligation. Women who had entered the workforce to fill the positions vacated by men fighting overseas discovered that they were capable of doing those jobs, that the work was interesting and paid, and that the identity produced by professional work was different from, and in some ways more socially validated, than the identity produced by household management. When the war ended and the men returned, the majority of these women did leave their wartime employment, but they did not leave having forgotten what they had learned about themselves. A generation of women entered the 1950s having had direct experience of paid professional work, having managed that work alongside or in place of household responsibilities, and having formed an understanding of their own capabilities that the 1950s domestic ideal did not fully accommodate. Their daughters, raised in the post-war households that their mothers managed so efficiently and with such skill, grew up with the benefit of that efficiency without necessarily understanding its source or its difficulty. They grew up in comfortable, well-managed homes produced by mothers who had also demonstrated through wartime experience that women could do more than manage homes. The daughters drew the conclusion that was available to them, that the home could be managed by someone, that they were capable of working outside it, and that perhaps the choice their mothers had made was not the only one available to them. The economic forces that were building simultaneously made that conclusion more actionable with every passing year. The post-war economy was expanding the service sector and the clerical workforce at rates that created genuine labor demand for educated women. Colleges were admitting women in increasing numbers. The professions were beginning, slowly and unevenly, to open. And the income that a woman with professional employment could earn was becoming, by the early 1960s, large enough to constitute a meaningful contribution to household finances, at a time when the culture of consumption was expanding the range of things that households wanted to buy. Betty Friedan's book, published in 1963, articulated something that had been accumulating without a name. The problem she identified was the gap between the cultural ideal of fulfilled domesticity and the actual experience of educated women confined to it. The quiet dissatisfaction of capable people whose capabilities were not being used. The book sold over 1 million copies in its first year. It sold because it described something that millions of women recognized. What changed in the 1970s? The legal frame. The 1970s formalized what had been building for 2 decades, and it did so partly through legislation that permanently altered the legal and economic landscape for American women. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 had already established the principle that women and men performing the same work were entitled to the same pay. In practice, the Act's enforcement was limited, and wage gaps persisted across most industries. But the legal principle was in place, and the decade that followed would build on it. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972 prohibited sex discrimination in educational programs receiving federal funding. Its immediate effect was the expansion of women's athletic programs, which became its most visible legacy. Its larger effect was the normalization of the expectation that women would receive the same educational opportunities as men in every field, including the professional schools whose degrees were the entry point to the most economically valuable careers. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 prohibited discrimination against credit applicants on the basis of sex or marital status. Before this law, a woman who applied for a credit card or a mortgage in her own name could be denied on the basis that she was female, regardless of her income or creditworthiness. A married woman could be denied credit that depended on her own income because the lender might assume that she would become pregnant and leave the workforce. The 1974 Act made this discrimination illegal, and its effect was to give women independent economic existence in the credit system for the first time. These legislative changes did not by themselves change how American households operated, but they created the legal framework within which the behavioral changes of the decade could take root and persist. They made it possible for women to maintain economic independence that was genuinely independent, to build careers that were genuinely their own, and to constitute household income that was genuinely theirs rather than their husband's income to which they happened to have access. The mother going to work and what it did to the home. The single change that most directly altered the daily life of the American household in the 1970s was the entry of mothers of young children into the paid workforce in numbers that had no precedent in American history. In 1960, approximately 20% of mothers with children under 6 years old were employed outside the home. By 1980, that figure had risen to 45%. By 1990, it was 60%. The transformation was not incremental. It was rapid, and its effects on the daily organization of family life were immediate and permanent. The household that had been managed by a full-time, at-home manager suddenly needed to be managed in the hours before work, after work, and on weekends by two people who were both working outside the home during the hours when household management had previously happened. The weekly rhythm of household tasks that the 1950s housewife had distributed across the days of the week could no longer be distributed across days when everyone was at work. It was compressed into weekends, which meant that Saturday and Sunday became, in millions of American households, the days when everything that had not been done during the week needed to happen, and that the weekend rest that the household had previously been able to protect was consumed by the accumulated household management that had no other available time. The cooking changed first and most visibly. The 3 daily meals, prepared from scratch by a person who was home to prepare them, could not survive the transition to a household where the cook was also working a full day outside the home. Dinner, the meal that had been the household's primary nutritional and social event, became what it had never been in the previous era, a problem to be solved quickly rather than a meal to be prepared properly. The processed food industry, which had been building its product lines and distribution capacity since the 1950s, was positioned to offer solutions to this problem that were genuinely convenient and that the household that was now time-pressed had genuine reason to accept. Frozen dinners, canned soups that could be on the table in 15 minutes, boxed pasta dinners, instant everything. These products existed in the 1960s. In the 1970s, with the time pressure of the dual-income household bearing down, they became the primary food supply for millions of American families, rather than the occasional convenience they had previously been. The nutritional consequences of this shift were real and are documented. The Harvard School of Public Health has published research tracking the change in the American diet that correlates with the period of women's mass entry into the workforce, showing measurable reductions in the quality of home-prepared meals and corresponding increases in the consumption of processed and restaurant food. These changes did not happen because American families stopped caring about nutrition. They happened because the person who had been responsible for nutrition was no longer available to manage it during the hours when it needed to be managed. The children and the hours after school. If the change in meals was the most visible, immediate consequence of the working mother in the 1970s household, the change in children's afternoon experience was the most profound, long-term one. In the 1950s and early 1960s, the afternoon hours after school were hours in which children came home to a parent who was there. The significance of this is not primarily supervisory. Children who are not actively getting into trouble do not require supervision in the security monitoring sense. The significance is relational. A parent who is present in the afternoon is a parent who is available for the slow, casual, unpressured conversation in which children say things they would not say in a scheduled family meeting or at a dinner table where everyone is tired and the evening is running short. A mother making dinner in the kitchen while her child does homework at the table, or sits nearby talking about the day, or helps with something in the kitchen, is a mother who is receiving the ambient information about her child's life that does not present itself on demand, but emerges in the natural flow of shared time. She knows what the child's friends are doing. She knows when something is wrong before it becomes a problem that requires intervention. She knows, in the 1,000 ways that people who spend time together know things about each other, who her child is, and who her child is becoming. When both parents are working until 5 or 6 in the evening, the hours between 3 and 6 become what researchers eventually named the latchkey phenomenon. Children coming home to empty houses, managing their own afternoon, without supervision, and without the particular nourishment of adult presence during the hours when their developing minds were most open to influence. Studies conducted by the Search Institute in Minneapolis across the 1980s and 1990s documented the relationship between adult presence in a child's afternoon hours and outcomes, including academic performance, behavioral development, and resistance to early substance use. The data were consistent across economic categories. The presence of an adult, not necessarily a parent but an engaged adult, in the afternoon hours produced measurably better outcomes than the absence of one. The 1970s created the latchkey generation, not through indifference to children, but through the collision of economic necessity and feminist principle with the practical reality of what supervision-free afternoons do to children over years. The generation that grew up in those afternoons became the parents of the 1980s and 1990s. And the parenting anxieties of those decades, the helicopter parenting, the overscheduled childhood, the intense supervision of every unoccupied moment, can be read partly as the response of a generation that had had too little supervision, trying to provide a generation of children with too much of it. The household that had no manager. The deeper structural change in the American household of the 1970s was not the change in cooking or the change in childcare arrangements. It was the elimination of the position of household manager. Every organization of any complexity requires someone in the role of manager, someone who holds the overview, someone who knows what needs to happen next, what has been deferred and cannot be deferred further, what the inventory levels are, what the maintenance schedule requires, what the social calendar holds. In the 1950s household, that person was the housewife. Her role was not simply the execution of domestic tasks, it was the management of the household as an enterprise. When she went to work outside the home, the management position was not filled by someone else. It was eliminated. The tasks that had been managed were either dropped, contracted out, or distributed between two people who were both also working full-time and who performed them at the margins of time and energy rather than at the center of a working day organized around their completion. The consequences of managing household life at the margins rather than the center are visible in every American home where both adults work full-time and where the house is managed reactively rather than proactively. The laundry is done when it becomes urgent rather than on a schedule that keeps it from becoming urgent. The grocery shopping is done without a meal plan, because the meal plan requires forward thinking that happens during quiet time, and quiet time is scarce. The repair that was needed 3 months ago has not been made because making it requires scheduling someone to come, which requires being home to receive them, which requires taking time from work, which is possible but effortful and keeps getting deferred. The American Journal of Sociology published research in the 1990s quantifying the hours of household labor performed in dual-income households compared with single-earner households from the same economic tier. The finding was that dual-income households performed significantly fewer total hours of household labor than the single-earner households they had replaced, not because the same tasks were being accomplished more efficiently, but because many of the tasks were simply not being accomplished. The management gap was real, and it was being filled by the household simply operating at a lower standard of maintenance than the previous generation had considered acceptable. What Europe did differently. The same economic forces that drove American women into the workforce in the 1970s were operating in European economies simultaneously, and European societies responded to those forces in ways that produced different outcomes for family life and household organization. In Scandinavia, where women's labor force participation rose as rapidly as in the United States during the 1970s and 1980s, the policy response included the development of heavily subsidized childcare infrastructure and the introduction of parental leave policies that allowed new parents to manage the transition to working parenthood without the complete loss of either income or childcare quality that the American approach produced. Sweden introduced a gender-neutral parental leave policy in 1974, making it one of the first countries in the world to do so. The policy allowed either parent to take paid leave after a birth, and over time evolved into a system that actively encouraged fathers to take substantial portions of the available leave. The result, visible in Swedish family life statistics today, is a more equal distribution of household labor between partners, a higher quality of childcare during the early years, and measurably better outcomes for children on the developmental and educational measures that track these things. Germany took a different approach, maintaining a stronger cultural and economic support for the single-earner household through the 1970s and into the 1980s, with tax policies that incentivized the division of labor in which one partner worked and one managed the household. The German Hausfrau of the 1970s was less pressured than her American counterpart to enter the workforce, and the German household of the 1970s maintained more of the organized, managed quality that the American household was losing during the same period. France built its creche system, the network of subsidized infant and toddler care centers that made French women's return to work after childbirth possible without the child care quality sacrifice that American women faced. The French approach produced women's labor force participation rates comparable to the American ones, while maintaining a higher standard of early childhood care than the American market-based child care system delivered. The common thread across the European responses to the same forces that were reshaping the American household is that European policy acknowledged that the household management function that women had been performing had real economic and social value, and that when women left the home for paid work, the value they had been producing did not disappear. It became a problem that someone had to solve, and the solution required either policy infrastructure or continued undervaluation of the caring work that had previously been invisible. The United States, with its cultural resistance to policy solutions that resemble the social welfare models of European countries, largely did not build that infrastructure. American families navigated the transition to dual-income life primarily on their own, managing the gap between what the household needed and what two people both working full-time could provide through a combination of reduced standards, contracted services, and the particular exhaustion of people trying to do two full-time jobs with the energy available for one and a half. The meals that disappeared. The family dinner was the last casualty of the changes of the 1970s, and its decline is worth dwelling on because the family dinner was not merely a meal. It was the daily ritual through which the family constituted itself as a social unit. Research conducted across the following decades would quantify what was being lost. A 2009 study, published in the Journal of Adolescent Health, found that adolescents who ate dinner with their families 5 or more times per week were significantly less likely to engage in substance use, more likely to report positive academic performance, and more likely to describe close relationships with their parents than adolescents from comparable families who ate together less frequently. The relationship held across economic categories and was robust enough to be described by researchers as one of the most consistently protective factors in adolescent development that the data reliably identified. The family dinner's protective function was not the food. It was the time, the 30 to 45 minutes of daily shared presence, in which family members were together without agenda, without performance, without the particular social anxiety of scheduled family activities, and in which the conversational flow of people who know each other well produce the kind of mutual awareness that is the actual substance of family connection. In the 1950s household, this dinner happened every evening, was expected to happen, and was prepared by a person who had had the daytime hours to plan it and the energy to execute it. In the 1970s household, with both parents returning home tired from full working days, the family dinner became something that required a specific effort to maintain, rather than the default outcome of the household's daily organization. The effort was real, and many families made it, but many did not. And the decline in family dinner frequency across the 1970s and 1980s is documented in household survey data from the period. The National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University began tracking family dinner frequency in the 1990s and found that by the late 1990s, only about a third of American families with teenagers were eating dinner together 5 or more times per week, down from rates that household survey data from the 1950s suggest were much higher, though comparable survey data from that era is difficult to compare directly. The knowledge that walked out the door. One of the least discussed losses of the transition from the 1950s household to the 1970s dual-income household is the knowledge loss. The practical, embodied, specific knowledge of household management that had been accumulated across generations of women who managed homes full-time and who transmitted that knowledge to their daughters through years of shared daily practice. How to stretch a food budget across a week of nutritious meals. How to clean different surfaces with appropriate materials without damaging them. How to keep laundry in good condition across years of washing. How to maintain a schedule that kept the household's accumulated tasks from becoming an unmanageable backlog. How to manage social relationships through correspondence, through the conventions of hospitality, through the particular skills of community maintenance that keep a family embedded in a network of mutual support. This knowledge was transmitted primarily through observation and participation. A daughter who grew up in a well-managed household absorbed its management practices without necessarily being taught them explicitly, the same way a person who grows up speaking a language absorbs its grammar without being taught rules.
The knowledge lived in the practices, and the practices lived in the daily life of the household. When the practices ended, the transmission ended.
The generation of women who entered the workforce in the 1970s and 1980s, and who spent their household management time in the margins of evenings and weekends rather than at the center of weekdays, did not transmit the knowledge that their mothers had transmitted to them, because they did not have the time to practice it consistently enough for the knowledge to stay alive. And their daughters were not present during the days when household management happens to absorb it through observation. The result is that the practical household management knowledge that was universal among American women in 1950 is now genuinely rare. Surveys of young American adults on basic food preparation skills consistently find that large percentages cannot cook a simple meal from scratch ingredients, cannot perform basic household repairs, and do not have the organizational systems for household management that would allow them to maintain a home at the standard that the previous generation considered the minimum baseline. This is not a failure of character or a decline in intelligence. It is the predictable result of knowledge that stopped being transmitted. The knowledge did not become obsolete. It became unavailable, because the conditions that had transmitted it disappeared before anyone thought to find a different transmission mechanism. The men and what they did not do. An honest account of what changed in the 1970s has to address the behavior of men during this transition, because the history of this period is sometimes told as if the changes in women's roles simply happened as forces of nature, without the accompanying history of how men responded to those changes in the household. The sociological research on housework distribution in dual-income households tells a consistent story. When women entered the paid workforce in large numbers in the 1970s, they did not exit the household labor force proportionally. They added paid work to existing household work rather than substituting one for the other. The additional hours worked outside the home reduced, but did not eliminate their household labor contribution, while men's household labor contribution increased only modestly. Arlie Hochschild's 1989 book, which documented the phenomenon through detailed observational research, named it the second shift. Working women in dual-income households were performing a second shift of household and childcare labor after returning from their first shift of paid work outside the home. The men in these households were performing significantly less household labor than their wives, and the gap between what women were contributing to the household and what men were contributing was generating the particular exhaustion and resentment that Hochschild documented in her interviews. The data from time use studies conducted by the University of Michigan across the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s quantify this pattern precisely. In the 1960s, married women performed approximately 32 hours of household labor per week, while married men performed about 4 hours. By the 1980s, women's household labor had decreased to approximately 19 hours per week as their paid employment hours increased, but men's household labor had increased only to about 10 hours per week. Women were doing less, but they were still doing far more, while also adding paid work hours that men had always been performing. The household that emerged from this transition was one in which the total hours of household labor performed were significantly fewer than in the previous single-earner model. But the distribution of the reduced labor was also still unequal, and the result was households that were simultaneously under-maintained relative to the previous generation's standard and generating inequality between partners that produced the specific relationship tensions that characterize much of the family life discourse of the following decades. What was lost and what cannot be recovered? Simply looking back across the distance of 50 years, the losses of the 1970s transition are clearer than they were to the people who were living through it.
because distance allows the consequences to be seen that proximity obscured. The managed household is largely gone.
The home that was run according to a system, that had a person responsible for its organization who had the time to maintain that organization, that operated proactively rather than reactively, that was clean and ordered and prepared as a matter of daily habit rather than weekend rescue mission, is not the standard experience of the American household today. It exists in households where one partner has chosen to manage the household full-time, and those households operate at a measurably different standard of organization and family well-being than the dual-income households that now constitute the majority. The family meal has declined to a frequency that represents a fraction of what it was in the period before the 1970s transition. The Hartman Group, a food industry research firm, found in surveys conducted in the 2000s and 2010s that the majority of Americans do not eat regular family dinners, and that the family dinner as a daily institution has been replaced for most households by a more fragmented food culture in which family members eat at different times, often different food, often in different rooms. The social and developmental consequences of this fragmentation are real and documented. The transmitted household knowledge is gone for most of a generation, and the consequences are visible in the food skills data, in the household maintenance skill data, in the basic domestic competence data that consistently show younger American adults less capable of managing their households than older ones in ways that reflect knowledge loss rather than preference. The child care quality available to families where both parents work has been a persistent concern since the 1970s, when the sudden demand for non-parental child care outpaced the supply of quality options and created a market in which cost pressures consistently worked against quality, producing the child care quality crisis that American policy has been unsuccessfully trying to address for 4 decades. These are real losses. They happened alongside real gains, the economic independence of women, the professional advancement that became possible when the workforce opened, the fuller use of women's capabilities, the reduction in the social isolation that confined domesticity could produce. Both the losses and the gains are real. Both deserve honest accounting. What the European comparison tells us: if the 1970s changes in the American household produced the losses described, and if the European societies that experienced the same forces produced different outcomes, the question is, what the European approach preserved that the American one did not? The answer is simpler than the policy details might suggest. European societies, particularly the Scandinavian ones, treated the work of household management and child care as economic work with economic value, and built policy structures that reflected that understanding. Parental leave policies that paid parents to care for their children during the early years, subsidized child care that maintained quality when parents returned to work, tax systems that did not penalize the household where one partner managed the home while the other worked for income. These policies did not prevent women from entering the workforce. They made it possible for women to enter the workforce without the total loss of the household management function that the American approach produced, because they created the infrastructure that allowed the household management work to continue in some form while the economic work was also happening. The American approach was to treat the transition as a private matter for individual households to negotiate, which meant that each household faced the same problem with the same insufficient resources and produced the same improvised solution, which was simply to do less than the previous generation had done and hope that what was dropped was not the thing that turned out to matter most. What turned out to matter most was not any single thing. It was the accumulation, the meals that were not cooked,
the conversations that did not happen in the afternoons, the household organization that was not maintained, the children who came home to empty houses,
the family dinners that were replaced by separate meals at separate times, the practical knowledge that was not transmitted because the conditions for transmission were gone. Each one of these was a small loss. Together they constituted a transformation in American family life whose consequences the culture is still processing. What can be reclaimed? The 1970s cannot be undone, and it would not be desirable to undo them. The economic independence of women is real and valuable, and not something any honest account of the period would wish away. The professional achievements of the women who entered the workforce in that decade and the decades since are real achievements that produced real value for the economy and for the women who accomplished them. But the practical wisdom that was embedded in the managed household of the previous era did not become obsolete when the conditions that produced it changed. The value of a planned meal, cooked from real ingredients, eaten together at a table, has not diminished because the household that produces it now has 2 working adults rather than 1. The value of a household maintained by system rather than rescued by periodic effort has not diminished because the person maintaining it is now working outside the home as well. The value of an adult who is present during a child's afternoon hours has not diminished because both adults now have professional identities that extend beyond the household. What changed was the available time and energy for these things. What was lost was not the value, but the capacity. And the capacity can be partially recovered, not by returning to the arrangements of the 1950s, which were unfair in ways that the evidence is clear about, but by treating the household management function as real and valuable work that deserves real and adequate time and attention. The households that do this in the modern era, where both partners share the management function genuinely, rather than leaving it to fill the margins of one person's already full schedule, tend to operate more like the households of the 1950s than like the average contemporary household. They tend to be better organized. The meals tend to be better. The children in them tend to report stronger family connection. The sense of household order that produces the calm that people remember from those older homes tends to be present. The system was not the 1950s domestic arrangement. The system was the managed household. What managed it was a person with the time and the knowledge and the social support to do it. The question that the 1970s raised, and that has not been fully answered since, is how to maintain the managed household in a world where the arrangements that produced it are gone. And the answers that European societies have partially found, and that American culture has partially resisted, are still the most productive direction in which to look. The house that was always ready. There is a quality that people who grew up in well-managed households of the 1950s and early 1960s describe consistently when they talk about those homes. Not the cleanliness exactly, though the homes were clean. Not the order exactly, though the homes were ordered. Something that produced the feeling that the house was ready. Ready for the next meal. Ready for the afternoon. Ready for company. Ready for the family to come home and be there. That readiness was the product of a system, a person who had the time to manage the household, the knowledge to manage it well, the daily habits that kept it in the state of readiness, rather than allowing it to fall behind and then heroically rescuing it, and the cultural support that told her the work she was doing mattered, even when the culture also failed her in other ways. The readiness is gone from most American households today. Not because people care less, not because the people managing homes are less capable,
but because the conditions that produced it, the time, the knowledge, the system, the daily habit, have been lost to a transition that happened too fast for the replacement infrastructure to be built. The 1970s is when those conditions ended. The work of the decades since has been, partly consciously and partly not, the attempt to understand what was lost and how it might be recovered in a form that the present can sustain. That work is not finished.
But understanding where it started is part of how it moves forward. Please subscribe before you go. We keep finding these turning points in American daily life and what they tell us about how we got here and where we might go, for as long as they are worth understanding. And we believe they are worth understanding for a very long time yet.